Good afternoon. Today we'll talk about research methodology. And instead of talking too much, I want to show you some information so that it will be more clear about what is research methodology or what is even research. So I'll share the screen with you so that things are very clear. So let us begin with the simple basic question. Introduction to research. Very often we think of research, we want to carry out research, but we don't know what exactly to do because our ideas about research are not very clear. When we learn up to postgraduate degree, we are taught in the class, we are asked to learn, understand, remember, write in the exam, and then there is no further question about what have you learned, why did you learn this, why did you do this, are there any relations between different things that you learned. There are so many unanswered questions. When we go to research, then all such questions will have to be answered: the relevance, the reference, the importance, the justification, and so on. So let us begin with our understanding of research. So all of us are aware of research, but we do not have a good understanding of what it is really, or why it is necessary, what is the importance of research, what are the possible outcomes from the research. So a question is, sometimes we feel that there are very good people, very intelligent people, very few people who can conduct research. So research is not for everybody. So research may require very high level of intelligence. Research involves very hard work, so you may not be able to sleep restfully in the night. So do we have to have sleepless nights, and is the research unending, and so on. So there are many questions that keep most of us away from research. So due to the fear, we don't attempt to do the research. So what we have to remember positively is research is different from exercises and projects. So right from the school days, we have been carrying out exercises. There are exercises after every lesson. So what are exercises? A simple one question problem we call a problem. When we carry out certain activities to answer more than one question, we may call it an exercise. A project is a little larger. A project has an activity, has objectives, has preparation, has certain process. Now why we want to go beyond an exercise and a project. The purpose of an exercise is to answer the questions. The purpose of a project to try to find if there is something different, something new, something novel, or something unusual. So exercises are for confirming the knowledge that we have already obtained. Projects are for solving some real life problems. But research is for finding something new, either in theory or in application. And therefore, research must result in a substantive, that is, there must be some substance of the contribution to the domain of study. So if I want to carry out research in physics, then my research should result in some contribution to the either theory or application of physics. If I want to carry out research in mathematics, then I should contribute to the domain, that is to mathematics, some result, something substantive. That is, it should not be illustration only, but there should be some contribution. Similarly, if I carry out research, I should become more knowledgeable. That is, as part of my activity, I should also acquire knowledge. And this knowledge should go beyond reading, remembering, and recalling. Because typically learning is defined in terms of 3 R's: read, remember, and recall. Research should go beyond this. So some people describe research as search for new knowledge. So we can look at different dictionaries. Oxford English Dictionary defines research in some way. Cambridge English Dictionary also defines research. Merriam-Webster Dictionary also defines research. There is a website dictionary.com, so online dictionary, it also defines. Then there is a Collins Dictionary. So I will not go through this. You can later on, I will share this file with you, so you can take your own time to read about different definitions. But we commonly use terms like discovery and finding when something comes to light unexpectedly. So very often, discovery is a very known term. Even there is a discovery channel. So what comes to light, not to be unknown, but is usually not noticed, explained, or understood. Research should go beyond discovery. So discovery is very often accidental. By chance, we come across something, we find something, so we say something has been discovered. For example, the Ajanta caves were not known to even the local people for a long time. So some hunter went for hunting and suddenly he discovered Ajanta caves. He did not invent them. He did not create. He only discovered because they were already there. But research cannot be accidental. It has to be with a purpose. For example, discoveries are known in science. There have been many discoveries. What we experience in order to learn is research. So research has a purpose and we have to carry out certain learning. We have to learn something more. So in short, research is a search for new knowledge. Very often the problem is we don't know exactly what is knowledge. So before we try to understand knowledge, we think of three words, useful and important words related to research: data, information, and knowledge. Very often people use all these three as if they mean the same thing. In reality, they are not same. They are not only different, but there is also an order between them. That is, they are not even at the same level. So data is the at the very bottom. So data, what does the data mean? Data is what we acquire, what we obtain. Either we get it through observations, through a questionnaire, which we call the primary data source, or we may read some published article and we get some data from published work. We call it secondary data source. So that is data. So data are collection of facts, and in themselves they are meaningless. If I say that last year between Pune and Baramati, there have been so many accidents. Now, do I understand whether the number of accidents was high or low? No, data in itself has no meaning. When does data acquire some meaning? When it is processed and some information is extracted from it. So we must process data and we must extract information from data so that we get some meaning out of it. So information cannot be observed directly. It has to be extracted from data. And therefore, in some sense, information is one level above data. In other words, the amount of data can be very large, but the amount of information that we extract from data is not so large. It is like a extracted essence. So it is small in volume, but more useful and meaningful. So information is what makes sense from data. Data in itself is meaningless. Information gives it a meaning. So data is usually very large in volume. Information is concise and small in volume. And therefore it is easier also to represent or to present information than presenting data. Very often now the data that we obtain, collect is called raw data, whereas information is extracted, extracted from the data or obtained from the data. And usually why do we need information? Information is used for answering a question. So only when we have some question, we'll try to get the relevant information from data so that we can answer a question. The quantity used to express a characteristic is usually called a parameter. For example, we think of COVID test. So is a particular person COVID positive or not positive? So we use certain characteristic and we call it a parameter. So it may be the temperature, it may be the oxygen level. So there can be different characteristics. So we call a parameter. So the interest is in finding the value of the parameter so that we can take a decision or we can answer a question. Is a particular person COVID positive or COVID negative? So observations are data, and the purpose of extracting information is to know the value of the parameter. So in statistics, very often we call it estimating the parameter. That is trying to find out the value of the parameter. Now knowledge can neither be acquired, that is, we cannot obtain directly from like data, nor we can extract it from raw data like information. So knowledge goes one level above information. Why? Because knowledge has to be developed over time through experience of extracting information from data. So I have some data set, I extract information. I get another data set, I extract information. So if I continue this activity, gradually I try or I develop some skill or some ability to decide what method of extracting information should be used when I get the data. Now this is not part of data, it is not part of information, it is beyond this. So we call it knowledge. So data and information are concrete, whereas knowledge is abstract. And therefore knowledge cannot be seen, knowledge cannot be shown, but knowledge has to be experienced and has to be used so that people know or people believe that you have some knowledge. So even though data and extracted information are numerical, knowledge is not numerical. So data and information can be presented numerically, tabular, in the tabular form or in the graphical form, but knowledge has to be expressed in terms of sentences. So data is a collection of facts, information is the meaning of this data, and knowledge is the understanding of the data as well as the information that is contained in this data. And therefore, what is the use of knowledge? It is useful in taking decisions. So it is not like answering question 1, answering question 2, answering question 3, but taking a decision in a certain situation. Therefore, knowledge is one of the objectives of research. So why is knowledge objective of research? Because we develop a rule for taking decisions. So when something happens, do something. Imagine chemist or chemistry student trying to carry out certain chemical reaction. Now this person has to know the situations or conditions for the reaction to go through. How do we know? Even the simple experiment of neutralization. I have some acid, I try to put some alkaline material liquid in it, and I should know when exactly neutralization has occurred. So research has one of the objectives, knowledge, understanding of the phenomenon is essential for effective application. So very often knowledge is also considered to be same as understanding. Knowing is different from understanding. So information tells us what we know. Knowledge tells us what we understand. Now there are different types of researches. Very often the second problem with attempting research is very often we are not clear as to what are the possible types of researches and what type of research is my interest or is appropriate for me. So there are different classifications of research depending on different aspects of research. So for example, begin with two major types. One is called exploratory and other is called explanatory or confirmatory. So exploratory research begins with no assumption or no knowledge about what to expect from data. So when we try to explore, we don't go with any ideas, we just go to some field and explore. Therefore it is called exploratory. So what is the knowledge that we acquire from exploratory research? We acquire only characterizations. We try to find out what is happening. Then we may compare with some known phenomena. Then we may try to find out what is new, what is different, how much is different. So exploration. So this is typically common in new areas. For example, COVID has given opportunity to many scientists to carry out exploratory research. For example, what is the infection mechanism? What is how to calculate the infection rate? How to calculate the duration for which a person is unsafe after acquiring or after testing positive for corona? So there are many questions which will lead to exploratory research. Explanatory research begins with a hypothesis and attempts to either confirm or refute the hypothesis. So exploratory research is very often based on a hypothesis. Suppose I believe in Darwin's theory. So I say, okay, Darwin's theory is my hypothesis. Then I go and try to find out some phenomena where I can confirm that Darwin's hypothesis or Darwin's theory is correct. So there are two types of researches. One begins with a hypothesis, and the objective is to either verify, confirm the hypothesis, or if I get counter examples, examples which do not fit in the hypothesis, I may claim that the hypothesis is really not true. And the second, I just want to know. That is pure knowledge, as they sometimes call. Now, different authors have described different types of researches. So there are even more classifications of research due to or by different authors. Most of them have ignored the fact that research can be classified in different ways according to different approaches. So as the approach changes, we may classify the same or the research activity in a different way. Similarly, research can be classified in different ways according to different components of research. Some important classifications of the research now we can see. So either we look at the approach of the research, or we can look at the components of the research, or even sometimes we look at the methodology. So the first classification we saw, exploratory versus explanatory, is according to the background of the research. Did we have knowledge and then we are trying to confirm it or try to refute it? So, or we have no knowledge. So this is the based on the background, researcher's background. But another type of research according to the method of collection of data. So depending on how we collect the data, there are two types of researches. One is called empirical and other is called experimental. Empirical research is based on observing the data that already exists. Example, social surveys, socioeconomic surveys, forest surveys, and so on. They are examples of empirical research. So empirical research is based on the assumption that the process of data collection does not affect the observations themselves. So if my data collection method affects the observations, I am not carrying out any empirical research, because my activity of observation should not affect the observation. So observations have to be independent or free from the observer. Sometimes it is said that the observer must be outside the system and observe the system. On the other hand, experimental research, it is based on observing data that is generated by the researcher through an experiment. So the researcher conducts an experiment, generates observations or generates data and observes it. So as the result, what happens? The researcher's experimental activities are causing the variations in the observations. So experimental research can now further be two types: laboratory experiments or field experiments. For example, in agriculture, horticulture, in many animal husbandry experiments, initially some experiments are conducted in a laboratory under controlled conditions. If these experiments are successful, then similar experiments are conducted in the field where many environmental conditions are not under control. So experimentation also can be carried out at two levels: laboratory or the field. It is obvious that experimental results are stronger because the empirical results depend on what is already there. So very often the experimenter has no control over what is happening. On the other hand, the researcher has control on the experimental unit, and therefore the research is stronger in experimental research than in empirical research. But experimental research is not so common, because setting up the experiment, proving that my experimental setup is different and so on, that can be very hard theoretically. Another, if I look at the desired outcome of the research, so what do I want from the research? That can give me another classification. And what is it? Now we have four different types of researches. One is descriptive, other is inferential, third is diagnostic, and fourth is predictive. So what is descriptive research? It has the purpose of understanding the specified phenomena. So if there is a storm, a hurricane, and I have no experience of a hurricane or a storm, so what I do, I go to the affected area make observations so that I can describe the effect of the hurricane or the storm. So descriptive, just to understand what is happening. We don't have the question of why it is happening and so on, but we want to understand. So the result of such a research is a status report. So this is very common after natural calamities. An agency or a committee goes and tries to find out, explore the problems, and will give a status report that so much is the damage, so much is the human resource damage, and so on. Second is go beyond description and try to draw some inference, as we call it. That is, try to get information beyond the observation. So inferential research goes beyond descriptive statistics and aims at drawing inference about some unknown parameters. So parameters are quantities related to the population. So usually they are unknown because we can never observe the entire population. So the inferential research goes beyond the observed data and makes a statement about the entire population with observing it completely. So we then try to extend our understanding beyond what we have observed, and we try to apply to what is also not observed. Therefore, we call it inference, inferring about what is not observed, what is not known from or on the basis of what is already known. So that is inferential. So one step beyond description, descriptive statistics or descriptive research. Then third is diagnostic research. Now diagnostic research goes beyond drawing the inference, because inference is only trying to understand what is not observed. But now if we know what is happening to the entire population, then the attempt is to interpret the estimated population parameter. So how do I understand? For example, there may be high phenomenon of influenza. Obviously, my question is not only how many people are infected, what is the treatment, and so on. That is the post illness. But I also want to find out how does it or why does it happen, what is the cause, so I can try to prevent. So diagnostic research attempts to establish a cause and effect relationship among the observed variables. So it goes beyond the inference. Inference is only trying to understand what may be happening at the entire population level. Diagnostic research goes one step beyond and try to find out the cause and effect. So if I have some undesirable things happening, I try to find out the causes so that I can prevent that undesirable happening by controlling the causes, by preventing the causes. So first was descriptive. We can say we are trying to answer what is happening. Inferential, we are trying to answer, so what? I observe this, but what is happening at the global level, at the entire population level? Third is, why is it happening? So try to establish cause and effect relations. And fourth is called predictive. Okay, so what I have found is something is happening. It is happening due to a reason. But now the question is, what will happen next? So can I predict? So if the similar conditions continue, then can I find out what is more likely or what is likely to happen, most likely to happen? So predictive research goes beyond establishing relationships between the variables and attempts to predict the possible response when the values of the causal or predictor causal variables are specified. So if, for example, in the COVID case, if we ask a question that, okay, if 20% of the population gets infected, then what will be the consequence? How many people will be or will have the risk to life? So we can ask the question about prediction. So prediction goes beyond trying to diagnose. After I know the cause and effect relation, I try to find out how much will be the actual effect. So prediction. Another type of research or another classification is based on the nature of data. My data can be qualitative, my data can be quantitative. And accordingly, we say we have either we are carrying out qualitative research or we are carrying out quantitative research. So when the data is non-numerical, such as opinions, preferences, levels of agreement or disagreement, so very often the observations in the qualitative research are categorical. Now among categorical variables, there are two types. One is called nominal, other is called ordinal. So nominal means there are only different categories. Ordinal means there are different categories, but they can be put in one order. For example, preference. Now, in terms of preferences, I can have no preference, somewhat preferable, strongly preferable, very strongly preferable, or in the opposite direction also. I don't prefer this, strongly disagree, and so on. So there can be some categorical variables which are ordinal, and there are some categorical variables which are only nominal. They are only, like, if I think of a say toothpaste, sales of the toothpaste, different brands, I will not put them in order, just different brands. So they are nominal. So qualitative research usually involves only variables which can be observed non-numerically. So we'll have to record different responses. There can be opinion surveys, there can be opinion polls. So the responses are yes, no, prefer, don't prefer, like, don't like, and so on. On the other hand, quantitative research involves numerical quantifiable variables. Typically, they are obtained by measuring, or sometimes we obtain the observations by counting, but they are all represented or expressed in a numerical form. So qualitative against quantitative research. If you read books on research methodology, in the beginning, the books usually differentiate between qualitative research, quantitative research, and say that the research methodologies for qualitative research are different from the research methodologies for quantitative research. So we can look at those aspects after some time. So research is often associated with the nature of data, and therefore we have the classification of qualitative versus quantitative research. Another type of research, especially in the application areas. So some research can be conceptual or theoretical, some research can be applied. So what is conceptual research? It is not very common, but it has very high academic value. When we think of Nobel Prize winners, so Nobel Prizes in economics are awarded mostly to the researchers who have developed or propagated some economic theory. So a bank manager may not get Nobel Prize in economics because he usually does not, or is not expected to develop any economic theory. But there are some economists like Dr. Amartya Sen who has developed, or who has propagated, who proposed an economic theory, a new theory, and therefore he was recommended for the Nobel Prize. Conceptual research is difficult because it involves logical arguments rather than evidence based on observations. Usually what happens, we say observations provide us with some evidence, and based on the evidence we make some claims. But conceptual research is based on only logical arguments, because usually such research does not involve any collection of data, therefore no evidence, and therefore no proof. There is only a theoretical justification. On the other hand, applied research, which is very common, it also has a practical value. So, for example, the Nobel Prizes in natural sciences, medicine are awarded to researchers who have carried out applied research. So, applied research is relatively easy. That is what very often is felt, because it depends on the data, it depends on the experiment, but it also is restricted by the assumptions and conditions under which it is carried out. So assumptions and conditions, if they change, there is a need for research in order to understand the consequences. For example, a simple question, disinfection. Our understanding of disinfection was very different before COVID-19, and our understanding of disinfection is very different after COVID-19. Now, very often, many people even have stopped using the word infection and disinfection. They are going one step beyond it, and then uh, uh, they are trying to use certain stronger methods. How did it come about? How did we know? Experimental research, applied research. So very often the research which is useful in life is called applied research. Research which is very useful in improving the understanding is called conceptual research. So most of us may go for applied research because many of us are also working in applied areas rather than theoretical areas. But we should be aware that there are different types of researches. So different classifications according to nature of data, the methodology, the possible outcomes of the data, and different purposes. Now, why do we want to carry out research? So, is there any motivation? Is there any purpose? So, simple beginning is every research activity must be motivated by some ultimate target. So, I may apparently carry out some activities, I may get some results, I may publish them. Is that my target, ultimate target? My ultimate target may be beyond this. These are all intermediate steps before I achieve my target. So, for example, natural science research is usually motivated by the desire to understand some law of nature. So, I am reading some laws of nature. Suddenly, I try to, or I find out that it is something is not clear. Some law of nature is not clear. How do I understand it better? So, I carry out research. So, very often the natural science research is motivated by this desire. Now, why motivation is necessary? Because there is no other reason why the researcher should go through the rigorous and treacherous process. So research is not comfortable. Research is difficult. Obviously, why should I carry out research unless I am motivated? So motivation is necessary. If somebody forces me to carry out research, obviously I will not get so much involved. I will not get the good results in the research and so on. So I should be motivated. Every researcher must be or should be motivated. The purpose of research is an imaginary goal that the researcher has in mind, because the goal of the research is not visible now. We want to achieve it, and therefore, if the purpose of the research is not clear, then the research is not likely to be satisfactory. Very often, researchers cannot complete their research not because they are not working enough, not because they don't know the methodology, but the reason is very often the achievement target, final target, is not clear in their mind. So they are not clear about where to go and when to stop, how long to go, how much to go. So it is necessary for every researcher to explicitly state the purpose of research. Then the other details can be taken out, can be stated clearly. So other details depend on the objective, the purpose. So what do we mean by objectives of research? So every research activity must have a set of clearly stated achievable objectives. So when we make a statement of an objective, we should also keep in mind that it should be achievable. If there is something unachievable, then we are not carrying out research, we are only dreaming. We are trying to only fool ourselves. A research activity can have multiple objectives, and these must be stated clearly in the beginning of the proposal. So if I am writing a research proposal, I should make a list of what are my objectives. Because nowadays what happens, usually one or two objectives do not support a complete research. So if I want a research, because one objective may be enough for a research paper, not a research activity, and therefore we must have certain multiple objectives. Some precaution is necessary when we state the research objectives of the research. Why? Because it is important to keep in mind that the research is justified by inductive logic. Now, what do we mean by inductive logic? What is observed during research is not restricted or limited only to that time and location. So I observe something at some time at some place, but does it mean that whatever I have observed cannot happen at other times and other places? So first thing is, what I observe can happen at another time and at another location. The same or at least a similar result will be obtained in general if the same method is applied to data collected at other times and other places. Now this is my assumption. So if a patient is treated in the hospital, the patient gets cured. So the next time, if a similar patient is at home, because hospitals have no beds, can we say that the same treatment that was given to a patient in the hospital can cure the patient at home if the same treatment is given? That is what we call inductive logic. Observe on some and try to apply to all. So principle of induction is what happens on a part also happens on the whole. So one of the basic principles of research is the ability to or possibility of generalization. Otherwise, research has no meaning. If I study for a certain amount of time and I pass the exam. Can I claim that everybody who studies the same amount of time will also pass the exam? So unless I am sure, unless I am confident that what is observed in a particular situation also applies to another situation or all other situations, then we call it inductive logic. So one of the objectives comes from the inductive logic. So only theoretical research is deductive. That is, theoretical research begins with a universal rule, with a fact, established rule, and verifies whether it holds in the data that we observe by the researcher. Most of us get involved in research that is subject to inductive logic. Therefore, we shall not discuss the deductive research. We'll concentrate only on inductive research. So the principle of induction is also called the principle of evidential support. That is, we try to support our statement or our claim using evidence. So what happens to the observed is claimed to happen to the unobserved. So if I observe some students who are studying and who pass, I can generalize and say that even if I don't observe some students, if they are not studying, they are not likely to pass. They may not pass. So this is also called the principle of generalization. So one of the basic objectives of research is try to find out some general rules that will apply in general. So what I establish is only on a sample, but my claim is the same thing happens all over. That is on the entire throughout the population. So objectives of research must be listed in a systematic way. So I have to now develop a system. I should be more disciplined. Why? Because if I make a list of the objectives, then my activity also will begin from objective number 1, go to objective number 2, and so on. As I go on achieving objectives, I will go further. So I must be systematic. It should not happen that objective number 3 depends on objective number 5, because unless I achieve objective number 5, if I cannot go to objective number 3, then their order should be changed. So if there is a natural hierarchy among these objectives, then the objectives must be stated in their natural or hierarchical order. So very often the objectives can be ordered in a natural way. And then every objective must be stated clearly, and it should be possible to achieve the objective. So there is no point in stating impossible objectives. Tomorrow if I say that, okay, I want to boil water, but now here the water is boiling maybe at 100 degrees Celsius. I want to heat the water up to the temperature of the sun's surface. It is not achievable. So our objective should be also achievable, not only desirable, not only good for some research, but also should be achievable. So what are the 3 important things that we should remember, keep in mind? An objective must not be a wish. Just because I wish something happens, it cannot be objective of my research. Second, objective should not be vague. Very vague things are very easy to state, very difficult to achieve. So objective should be concrete, not vague. And third, the objective must be verifiable. If I claim that I have understood something, then other people should be able to verify that I have really understood it. So verifiability is also a criterion for an objective. Because if something cannot be verified, then we cannot call it an objective, because we can never know whether it is achieved or not. Types of data. All the research activities use data. They require data. Unless the research is very theoretical, other researches require data. Now the type of data must be decided before collecting data. That is, it is not appropriate to first go observe something, then say, okay, now my data will be of this nature. No, you have to first make a decision. You have to first decide what to observe, how to observe it. Is it based on counting? Is it based on measurement? It is based on questions. Is it based on some other procedure? So on. So the data type of data is also determined by the way of collecting the data. And therefore it must be decided before we begin collection of the data. Data consists of many variables, characteristics or features that are relevant to the research objectives. So my data should also be associated or should be relevant to my objectives. Otherwise, my objective may be one, and the data that I collect may not be able to give me any information about the objective of my research. So there must be some relations, some associations between the research objectives and data that we collect. The list of variables to observe must be prepared very carefully. So as part of my preparation for data collection, I will make a list of the variables that I want to observe. Now, what do we mean by preparing this list very carefully? If I think that some variable is useful and important for the research, it must be listed. If I find that some variable is there, but it may not be really useful or may not be really informative, I should be able to remove it. So the list of variables must be prepared very carefully by including variables that are important and not by including variables that are not so important. So this is based on some judgment, some prior knowledge. And therefore, very often research activities also indicate that people have some experience, and now on the basis of the experience, they are proposing a research activity. Second, data must be collected only one time, and that also should happen before a data analysis. That is what we should not have do. Is sometimes what happens, we begin data collection. So suppose day one, I collected some data. I came home or I came to the laboratory in the afternoon. I start analyzing data. And after I get some results of the analysis, next day I change my data collection procedure or policy so that I will get what I want. So what it says is data can be and must be collected only once, and that also should happen before any analysis of the data. So it is unethical to repeat alternate sessions of data collection and analysis. So I should not go to field, collect data, come back, analyze it, then again go back to the field, collect some more data, come back to the laboratory, carry out some analysis, again go back to the field. So we should not repeat alternate sessions of data collection and analysis. Collecting more data after analyzing available data can affect the future data collection. So if I collect data after having analyzed some part of available data, my future data collection may be affected by my understanding of the data. So we call this such an activity. What is the activity? We collect more data after analyzing part of data. We call it data snooping. And therefore it is recommended that we should avoid it. Or data snooping is not is not recommended, because data snooping leads to results which are based on the observations. So observation should be used only for analysis, not for collecting more data or not collecting more data. So one classification of data is based on the scale of measurement. Now in science faculty, many of us may be aware that there are four scales of measurement: nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. So we may not go too much into this. Nominal, as I said, are only different types, distinct values. Ordinal are not only distinct values, but there is an order. For example, in opinion surveys, strongly agree, then agree, no opinion, disagree, strongly agree. So such scales are called Likert scales. So there may be 5 levels, there may be even 3 levels: agree, no opinion, disagree, only 3 levels, or 5 levels, or 7 levels. Very strongly agree, agree, no opinion, disagree, strongly disagree, very strongly disagree. So there are different the more categories we generate, we should be more sensitive to how much, what is the level or degree of agreement or disagreement. So ordinal is also not so easy, so obvious. The two numerical, so the first two, nominal and ordinal, are categorical, no numbers. But the next two, the interval and the ratio, are numerical. So quantitative, not categorical. So the interval scale is measurement data. where measurements are numerical, and when I want to compare two numbers, two values, then the difference is meaningful. On the other hand, when I look at the ratio scale, it also consists of measurement data. It also is based on measurement data. But when I want to compare two numbers, the ratio is more appropriate for comparison. For example, if I look at the length, so I have two triangles and I know the sides of the triangles. So if I know two sides of a triangle, I can decide which side is longer than the other side, and I can also find out by how much is it longer. But if I look at percentages, very often we compare percentages by ratio. So ratio scale means when I want to compare two numbers, their ratio is more important or more informative. So measurements are numerical, but a meaningful comparison is made in the form of ratio. And therefore, we have two types. Sometimes we may think that interval scales are appropriate for arithmetic activities, like take the mean. Ratio scales are appropriate for geometric activities, like the geometric mean. So the calculation on the interval scale will be arithmetic mean. The appropriate calculation on the ratio scale will be geometric mean. That is, take the product of k numbers and take the kth root. That is the geometric mean. Similarly, now depending on the source of data, we can classify data into three categories. First is primary, secondary, and tertiary. So what is primary data? The primary data is that the researchers collects. So primary data can be the field data, survey data, laboratory data. So it can be collected somewhere, but it is the first time that the researcher is getting this data and using this data. Therefore, it is called primary, because the researcher very often is the primary owner, the first owner of the data. Secondary data is the data that the researcher obtains from a published source that contains the primary data. So I may collect some data, primary data, may analyze it, may write a research paper and publish my data. If somebody else takes these data, for that person it becomes a secondary data. So secondary, as we use the term second hand. So secondary, not secondary in the sense of importance. So some people confuse between these two comparisons. For some people, primary means most important, secondary means not so important. So here it is not by importance, it is only by the source. Where do I get data? So if I collect data on my own, I have primary data. If I get data from some published article or published source, I have secondary data. And third is called tertiary data. So tertiary data is the data that is published using a secondary source of data. So think of some scientist collecting data, analyzing it, publishing a paper. An author of a textbook, he is writing a textbook. So what he does, he collects information or examples from different sources. So as part of his text, he gives an example where he uses the published data in this paper. For this textbook, the same data becomes tertiary. It is like the third party. So it is obtained by neither the author of the book nor obtained by the source where he gets the data. The data was obtained or generated by the researcher who published a paper in a journal, and I am getting data from the journal. So it is the secondary. So some researchers call the tertiary data also secondary, because for them there are only two categories, primary or secondary. Data that I have collected is my primary data. Data that I have not collected is secondary. So that is subjective. We can think of two types or three types of data depending on the source of the data. Data is to be used in research. So there must be a single source. This source must be declared in the beginning. So one of the ethical practices in research is that when you get data from some other source, it is preferable to have a single source. We should not collect data from three different sources, mix it, and then forget the origins of the research or of the data and carry out analysis, because all the three data sets coming from different sources may not be appropriate to be put together. It is also unethical to claim that secondary data is my primary data. So sometimes people get some data from somewhere but claim that they have collected data. So it is unethical because nobody will be able to find out. So it may not be criminal, but it is so obviously not very ethical, unethical. When secondary data is used in research, it is necessary to declare the source of data and acknowledge it. So sometimes we may have to say, okay, I am interested in so and so problem, but I am unable or I cannot conceptually go and observe so much of data. So what I do, I find some publication and in some book where the data is made available. So I am going to use secondary data. So in my research activities, I should declare where I get the data, that is declare the source of data and also acknowledge. I should thank either author of the now data that we collect also will involve variables, and these variables can be of different types. So it is not necessary that all the variables must be of the same type. So data can have a lot of variety, not in terms of only the objects that I observe, but also what I observe on those objects. So that is what I call variables. So the method of data analysis depends on the type of the variable and the objective of the analysis. So as I go deeper in the research concepts, I will find that I have to plan more and more. Why? Because I have to also understand or try to plan what variables I will observe, what is the nature of those variables, what are the different types of variables, and what do I do with those variables. So what I do with the variables, very often this depends on what are my research hypotheses. So most of the research activities involve research hypothesis. Now please remember, hypothesis, hypothesis, is a singular, one hypothesis. Now the plural of this is hypothesis. That is, there are many, a collection of many hypotheses. Now how do we form hypotheses? Do they have any relationship with the objectives of the research? So we can think of this. So we begin again, think of this. We begin our research by stating the objectives. So in the beginning of the research proposal, we also have a list of objectives. What are my objectives? At the end of the research, we want to establish that we have achieved our objectives. So think of objective number one. How do I know that I have completed my or achieved my objective? So how can we make the claim that we have achieved a particular objective? So this requires a criterion. So I should also specify a criterion to verify that my objective has been achieved. So when I specify a criterion is usually in terms of a quantity, a threshold. So this criterion gives rise to a statistical hypothesis. For example, if I claim that say punctuality is strongly associated with hypertension, people who are punctual may not have any hypertension, but those who are not punctual will gradually get hypertension. So I have the concept. What is my criterion? My criterion may be, after observing so many people, if at least 20% of them show a strong relationship between non-punctuality and hypertension, then my objective is achieved. So when I have a criterion, that criterion is stated statistically in terms of a hypothesis. So my criterion gives a rise to a claim, and that claim becomes a hypothesis. If some objective has multiple criteria, there will be so many hypotheses. So every criterion for an objective gives me hypothesis, and therefore we should also be able to state research hypothesis. These are in the beginning important steps in developing a research proposal. For example, suppose a health science researcher begins research with the objective of developing a vaccine for the COVID-19 virus. So the criterion of success cannot be that every COVID-19 patient must be cured by the vaccine. 100% cure rate cannot be an objective, because so far no medicine has been 100% successful. Therefore, a certain proportion is specified. The developed vaccine must cure at least the specified proportion of patients in order to claim that the objective has been achieved. So the hypothesis is observed proportion of patients cured by the vaccine is not smaller than the proportion specified by the criterion. For example, we always or very often observe ads of maybe snow, even soaps, that this soap kills 99.9% bacteria. What does it mean? The company can never claim that the soap kills 100% of the bacteria. So they put a number smaller than 100%. But can we ever verify? Is this, if we try to test this hypothesis? So we should understand the hypothesis also should be verifiable. That is, it should be possible to test a hypothesis. So what is important to keep in mind is there is no distinction between the research hypothesis and statistical hypothesis. Research hypothesis is the statement of the interest of the researcher, whereas statistical hypothesis very often is no change, no difference, no effect. So we call it the null hypothesis. So statistical procedures of testing a hypothesis have a limitation that they can only test the hypothesis of equality, hypothesis of no difference, or hypothesis which is null hypothesis in the significance hypothesis. So the word null signifies no difference. For example, if I go to a pathological lab to check whether I have diabetes, I have hypertension, and so on, the pathological lab gives sometimes, most of the times, gives a report that nothing significant found or detected. NSD, nothing significant detected. When is something significant detected? Only when I have diabetes, or I have hypertension, or I have high blood pressure. So when there is nothing to diagnose, if nothing is diagnosed, we call it no result, negative result. That is the null hypothesis. So if I go for a testing, COVID test, for example, the null hypothesis is that I am not infected by COVID-19 virus. Only when there is a positive report, then the conclusion will be the null hypothesis is rejected and this person is declared COVID positive. So null hypothesis is no difference, no effect, no change, whereas the substantive research hypothesis is usually negation of this. If a pharmaceutical develops a new medicine, their claim is the new medicine is better than the already available medicines. But the statistician will prove or test the hypothesis that the new medicine is not different or is not more effective than the medicine that is already available. That is the null hypothesis. So only in practice, the statistical theory tests the null hypothesis, whereas the researcher is interested in the substantive or the alternative hypothesis, which they call research hypothesis. So typically what will happen? The research hypothesis and the statistical hypothesis are opposite of each other, but they are related. They are not independent. Another precaution that we have to take is how to state a hypothesis. Very often what we find is we say that something is not significantly different from the other. Now the word significant should not be part of hypothesis. Why? Because significance is a property of the sample quantity, not of the population quantity. If I have two schools, I want to compare two schools. The hypothesis will be the passing percentage of the two schools is equal. We should not say almost equal, nearly equal. It should be equal, because in the population, our claim is that the two schools are not different. Therefore, the passing percentage of the students from the two schools is the same. Where is the word significant? In my observation, I may find the actual numbers to be different. Now, when I find the two numbers to be different, my question is, are they very significantly different or not significantly different? Therefore, the word significance or the property of significance applies to sample quantities, not to the population quantities. And therefore, when we state a hypothesis, the word significant should not be mentioned in the hypothesis. But if there is a comparison between two quantities, the hypothesis will state that there is no difference between the two quantities. We should not say that there is no significant difference between the two quantities, because then we are accepting that there is some difference, and our claim is that that difference is not too much. But that should be the conclusion of the research from sample, from the observations, not from the theory, from population. Similarly, research involves analysis of observed data. We have observations, that is what we call observed data, we want to analyze. Now, analysis should be carried out in steps, and all the steps must be clearly described and justified. So in the beginning, very often after stating the objectives of the research, hypothesis involved in this research, we may also give an outline of our research activity. There we describe the steps. First we will do something, then we will do so and so, then we will do so and so. So all the research activities which involve research must have some steps, and these steps should be clearly just not only stated, described, but we should also give reasons. Why do I want to do this? Why do I think that after step number 1, the step number 2 is necessary? And what we should remember is there is no unique way of presenting the results of the analysis. So what we find is objectives should be clearly stated. There should be some order in the objectives, because only after I verify objective number 1, I should go to objective number 2. Only after completing objective number 2, I should go to objective number 3. So there must be some ordering among the objectives. Now, as there is an order in the objectives, there will also be an order in the hypothesis, because hypothesis also will relate to the objectives in the same order. But when I try to get after the analysis, when I try to present the results, then there is no unique way, there is no single way. Why? Because sometimes the results can be presented in the numerical form, like the mean, this is the mean, this is the variance, this is the correlation. So I will specify, or I will describe some numbers. So one way of presenting results of the analysis is present the results numerically. Sometimes the results are presented more or more effectively in a table form. So I can also present results in a tabular form. Sometimes I like to present my results graphically, because the graphs are easier to understand or read than numbers. So if graphs makes it easy for the reader to understand the results, then I may want to present the results of my analysis graphically. So now the researcher has to decide. It is not necessary that even only one of the 3 methods should be used. Some results can be understood easily by numerical representation. Some results are easy to understand by the tabular representation. Some results are easy to understand when they are put in graphs. Somebody has stated that one graph can describe more than one paragraph of words, verbal description, only when the graph is proper, effectively used, and conveys the proper information that is intended. So graphical representation of results can be very attractive, and because it is attractive, it must be used very carefully. A graph can be easily misunderstood if it is not drawn carefully. For example, the scales on the 2 axes. So we have x-axis and y-axis. Now very often what people do when they want to misrepresent information in a graph, the scale on the x-axis is different from the scale on the y-axis. As a result, what happens? What appears to be a square in the graph does not really have equal length and height. So we should be careful in drawing graphs. There is no point in drawing a scatter diagram that occupies the entire page unless data is so large that patterns cannot be seen easily unless the graph is sufficiently large. So we should also think of the size of the graph, how much space it occupies. On the other hand, if I find or if I fit 4 graphs on one page, it is also not very good, because the reader cannot see exactly what I am highlighting in a graph. So there is no point in fitting 4 graphs on one page when the graphs convey some important result of the analysis. So also depending on the relative importance of different graphs, we should decide whether we should put one graph on one page or can we put more than one graph on one page. So the size of the graph, the scale, all these become important because we want the reader to look at the graph and understand something. So the graph also must be sufficiently clear or sufficiently large so that the reader can see what we want them to see, what do we want to highlight. Similarly, when we think of analysis and results, so we know the graphs are very useful in presenting results of the analysis if they are made very properly. So what should I do? The type of the graph should be carefully decided. Graphs are available in a large variety, so it is not now that graphs are very difficult and very few graphical options are there. No, graphs are available in a large variety. For example, I think of a simple question of data on one variable. So for graphs on a single variable, I have so many choices. I can begin with a bar diagram, a box plot, a dot plot, or histogram. So when I group the data, I get histogram. If I have individual observations, I get dot plots. If I put some observations together, I can get or if I have many observations of the same value, near the same value, I have bar diagrams. So there are options. And what do? They present the frequency distribution of a variable. So many people belonging to one class, so many people belonging to the other class. So I can represent frequencies either in numerical form or in the form of a bar diagram or a histogram and so on. So a box plot is useful in judging symmetry and locating the outliers. A bar diagram for a discrete variable or a histogram for a continuous variable is useful to visualize symmetry, pickedness. So how are the observations distributed? So what are the frequencies of different classes? Is the overall distribution symmetric? Is it flat? Is it peaked? We can answer so many questions only using the graph. For graphical representation of two variables, so this was for a single variable. If I have two variables, then we can draw what is known as the scatter diagram. One variable on the x-axis, one variable on the y-axis, and we put points at the places where the value of x and value of y they intersect. So we call it a scatter diagram. Now in addition to a scatter diagram, we can draw a line. Now how do we get that line? We can think of some relationship between the two variables and draw a line representing that relationship. So we can draw additional lines in a scatter diagram to convey some message about the relationship between the variables. Now after we present the results, we also must interpret the results, because results themselves are either in the numerical form, tabular form, or graphical form. Obviously the reader will again say, so what does it mean? So the interpretation must be in terms of the statement of the research problem. So interpretation will take the reader back to the research problem. I started with the objective. I said that I want to carry out research for this problem, this purpose. So interpretation must take us back to that original statement of the research problem. So use of statistical terms can be avoided or should be avoided when we are giving interpretation. So what happens? I have data on two variables. As a methodology, I calculate the correlation coefficient. For verification or as a test of hypothesis, I test the significance of the correlation coefficient. Now I want to give the interpretation. So how do I interpret? I should not interpret in the statistical sense, saying that, okay, the correlation between these two variables is significant. So I should not use the word significant. What should I do? I should go back to the original variables and say that there is a strong relationship or associationship between those two variables. And therefore, what is recommended is use of statistical terms should be avoided as much as possible when we provide the interpretation of the results. Now results of the analysis and the interpretation of these results will be followed by conclusions. So I have this data. I begin with my problem statement, objectives, hypothesis. Then I describe how do I collect data, analysis. Then I give results, interpretation of the result. Now the obvious question after all of this also is, so what? What do I understand? So I have to also give conclusions. What do I conclude? What do I understand? So results of analysis and the interpretation, and then what will follow are conclusions relevant to the research problem and research objectives. So I am trying to complete a circuit. I began with a problem. I have began with some hypothesis and so on. After analysis, I try to connect. How does this calculation answer my question number so and so? How does it achieve help me in achieving objective number so and so? So conclusions are typically, so what? The answer is to so what? This is the number. This is significant. This is very highly significant. So what? What do I understand about my original problem? So this is the conclusion, and the results must be presented in an order consistent with the order of the research objectives. So I have a list of research objectives. So my results will also be presented in the same order. So when a reader goes to objective number 1, result number 1, objective number 2, maybe analysis result number 2. So there should be some consistency so that the reader finds it easy or convenient to read the report of the research. Now, interpretation of the results. Usually, every research objective will be addressed with one procedure of analysis, and the result of this analysis is to be presented in the report. So, if I look at objective number 1, so objective number 1 is to verify that at least 75% people are willing to respond to my survey. So I actually carry out survey. So I keep reporting that I approached so many people and so many people have actually responded. Then analysis. So I calculate the percentage that so much percentage of people have responded to my questionnaire. In the interpretation, I go back to this claim that I wanted at least 25 or at least 75% people to respond to my questionnaire. And now after this analysis and result, I will try to connect the two. So have I really achieved the objective of having at least 75% people responding to my survey? Yes or no? So that is the conclusion. So if some research activity requires multiple steps of analysis, then there will be one result from every procedure. So if there are multiple steps, then I have to also arrive at a conclusion after every step is completed. So in this case, there can be multiple results corresponding to one research objective. So in the beginning, we said that one research objective will lead to one outcome. But it is possible that there can be multiple results corresponding to only one research objective. Why? Because it is important to remember that inference is not same as interpretation. Interpretation is only trying to understand the result that is obtained. Inference is trying to extrapolate or try to extend the result that we have observed on the sample to the unobserved part of the population. So inference is inductive, interpretation is only descriptive. So inference is a technical term, and inference is a statement about a population parameter for a specific variable. Interpretation is a statement that explains the meaning of the result of a statistical procedure. So meaning is given in terms of ordinary language, or in terms of the research problem. For example, in a social economic survey, the inference may be that the average per capita income of certain community is so and so. So this number is filled in, the statement will be the same, that the average per capita income of a certain community is this number. Therefore, the inference is that this particular community is poor or not poor, depending on my understanding of the poverty line. If their per capita income is below the poverty line, I will declare that this community is poor. and if not, then I'll say not poor. So whether a community is poor or found to be poor or not poor is the interpretation. The actual percentage of the poor people in that community is an estimate of the parameter. So it is our understanding. So inference is objective because it is a matter of fact statement, but interpretation is subjective because it depends on the context. And therefore, we should also understand that there is a difference between the inference, statistical inference, and interpretation of the result. Interpretation is subjective, therefore it is debatable. Inference being very technical and objective usually is not is not subject to any debate, so it's not debatable. Now when we carry out or when we plan research, we should also understand the scope for our research. So how much or how many people can use, so what is the scope, how much problem area can I cover with my research, and what are the limitations. So scope is from inside, how long can I, how far can I go, and limitations are from outside. What is not in my research, what will not be covered in my research, what will not be answered in my research. So even though research objectives are aimed at a certain target population, data may represent only a part of the target population, because I may not have access to the entire population that I would like to say aim at or include in my research. So what happens? My target population may be one thing, but the actual population that I can reach, I can observe from, is smaller. Then we call this population the study population. That is, my study is based on only in this population. So when study population is different from the target population, it is better to state the scope of the research in terms of the study population. So one person, a union leader, wanted to study problem of women workers in Pune. Now when we think of the word workers, women workers in Pune, now can we think of how many different work conditions we think of? So there are so many. And in reality, this researcher took only school and college teachers, only teachers, women teachers. Obviously, what does it mean? The research is limited to only teachers, whether they are in the school or college. But there are many other occupations where women may be working, but they are not represented. So what does this mean? The researcher must declare that my scope is only limited to school and college teachers and their problems. Other occupations are not covered. So when we describe the scope of the research, we are also indirectly specifying the limitations, because my research in such a case cannot apply to people who are outside these working conditions. For example, the peons in the schools, non-teaching people in even schools and colleges, other people in companies and so on. So many people are not covered. So we should be very clear about the scope and limitations of our research. Similarly, it is necessary to state if the research findings have any limitations in the form of assumptions. So if I begin with certain assumptions, I begin with saying that, okay, I want to study the school and college teachers. And if I ask or say approach and interview only those people who are confirmed, who are in the permanent job, then I should also mention this. So what is my assumption? The people I am including in my study have a confirmation, are in the permanent job. Why? Because their job security is safe. So the temporary teachers may have a different issue, may have different answers to my questionnaire. So it is necessary to state the assumptions or the conditions under which the research has been carried out. Similarly, statement of limitation will make the reader aware of the situations that are suitable for using results of the research. So when I make statements about the limitations, so where is my research applicable, where is my research not applicable? So if a researcher wants to read my research and try to apply to some situation, then the reader will compare. Read this. is the research applicable to the particular situation the reader is interested in. So it is very necessary, very important to also make statements about the scope and limitations so that the reader does not get misguided. Finally, it is desirable to describe possible directions of further work. So after I carry out my research, I have my research findings, I have the research, the conclusions, the interpretation. Now, obvious question is, so what? So can somebody else take up my research and do better, go further? So I should also have an idea about what is the future work, further work on the same topic. So either I call it necessary work in future or the scope for work in the future. Finally, in the sense of for some this topic, understanding research. The modern age has taken to us to a step where technology is necessary. So very often researchers think that their research is theoretical, their research is social, their research is economics. Therefore, they can don't have to use the technology. Now, use of technology does not depend on your domain of research. The use of technology is necessary because the technology makes it easy for you to present your results, to process the data. So there are many technologies that are useful for researchers. So technology has become pervasive in the sense that it is entering all the fields of research, and therefore we cannot avoid the technology anymore. So first thing that we may have to do is try to get some working knowledge of statistical analysis. That is the technical, more say analytical part. But also, when we want to keep on writing or preparing the reports of our research, we also have, or we should also know how to typeset. Typing is different from typesetting. Typesetting means we want to also the output appear in a desirable way. So every researcher should at some stage try to understand typesetting so that they can type their own thesis, and then there is no question of dependence on a typist, because the typist may type, again we have to make the corrections, we have to keep checking, and that takes more time, that can frustrate the researcher. So if the researcher knows how to typeset the material, then they become independent. So these two technologies I will recommend: some statistical knowledge or analysis knowledge and some typesetting. So the researcher must learn at least one statistical software package and learn how to make graphs, how graphs can be created, how graphs can be saved in a format that allows you to include them in a document. As an example, SPSS is a statistical package for social sciences. That is the short form is SPSS. It is popular among the social scientists. For more scientific research, there is a statistical software in the public domain, that is the free and open source software known as R, and it is easily available at the site. CRAN stands for Comprehensive R Archive Network. Archive because all the work so far has been archived, that is kept stored in the site. So cran.r-project.org. R was developed by statistics professors or faculty members, teachers in the Auckland University, New Zealand. So it is developed by scientists, by statisticians. So R is currently known as the best package-based environment for statistical computing and graphics. So R has many packages for analysis and graphics, and it is therefore recommended. The second aspect is the typesetting. So typesetting is different from typing. In typesetting, we must first visualize how do I want. Say for example, chapter heading. It should be bold in the center, at the top of the page, even the size should be larger, it should be bold, so on. So I should first visualize the output and then make the material appear in the way that we want. So the two popular packages that are being used, one of them is the MS Word, Microsoft Word. If we use MS Word for typing, we also must learn and practice how to insert tables and graphs in a document. Also, we should learn equation editor, because if we want to put some mathematical material, then we have to use the equation editor of the Microsoft Word. The other technology available, second, which is not so powerful, so popular, but is more powerful, is a software package known as LaTeX. It is spelled as LATEX, but it is read as LaTeX. So TEX stands for like technology. So there is a website, CTAN stands for Comprehensive Tech Archive Network. Now this TEX was the original package. It is developed by a mathematics professor. So it was initially aimed at mathematical typesetting. So tech.archive means many operating systems are supported, many fonts are supported. So LaTeX is a technology that helps us in preparing our document so that it looks attractive. The fonts are appropriate, spacing is appropriate, tables can be inserted, graphs can be inserted. So for example, for the Windows system, there is one package called ProText, PROTEXT. So we can search for it, download it, set it up, and we can begin typing. LaTeX, this is the package, generalized package. It has facilities for typesetting research papers and thesis very effectively. For example, in a thesis, my thesis has many chapters. So if I declare something as a chapter, the chapter heading is automatically made bold, large, and so on. The chapter numbers are automatically assigned. Then I have sections in the chapters. The section numbering is automatic. If I have equations in my typing, the equations are numbered automatically. So there are so many calculations that LaTeX makes, numbering. So if I insert an equation, all the other equations are numbered again appropriately. So I don't have to keep in mind, I don't have to keep note of, okay, this is equation number 1, this is equation number 2, and so on. So LaTeX takes care of this. Paragraphs, separation, spacing. So this presentation, for example, has been prepared using the LaTeX package known as Beamer. So Beamer is a LaTeX package for presentations. There are also packages in LaTeX, like the thesis is a package where writing a thesis, typing a thesis is very easy because it knows the style in which the thesis should be typed. So we look at the another important part of the research methodology. So this is my part 2. So here I will begin with some technical terminology, not the overall idea. For example, we will begin with data collection. Collection is one of the most important components of research, because very often the quality of the research is determined mostly by the quality of data. If I don't have good data, I will obviously don't have good research. So data is the research. Data in research is like the blood in the body. Every part of research involves data, just like every part of body requires blood. So the three main questions about acquisition or collection of data: what, where, and how. So what data should I collect, where should I collect it, and how should I collect it? So these three questions are important. Now, when it comes to what, the most desirable type of data is primary. So what type of data? So as far as possible, primary data. Now primary data is collected by the researcher. There are two benefits of having primary data. So when it is obvious that primary data will take some effort, will take some time, will take some money, will take some precautions and so on, but it is desirable. Why? One reason is the researcher knows the data very well, because the researcher himself or herself has collected data, and therefore if there are any errors in reporting or entering data, they can be easily found out and corrected before we begin the analysis. And the second is because the researcher has collected data, the intellectual property right, IPR, as has been become important on the data, is with the researcher. So the researcher does not have to take permission from somebody to use the data. There is no need of say NDA, as they call it, non-declaration, non-disclosure agreement, and so on. Because if I use secondary data, then I have to give an undertaking that I will not disclose names, I will not use this for any other purpose, and so on. So there has to be some agreement. So when I have primary data, I have the intellectual property right, so I am not obliged to anybody. So there is no need of to request for permission to use the data. The third is data collection must be planned carefully. Before we actually collect the data, we must first plan data collection, because data is the only tool available to the researcher to achieve the objective. We may have the tools, we may have some methodology, but that all of that becomes useful and meaningful only when data is good. Now, source of data. So in some cases of research, the researcher decides to use secondary data. It is also not uncommon, because very often the primary data collection can take so much of time, the researcher does not have so much of time. So sometimes we decide to use secondary data. Now when we decide to use the secondary data, the source of data must be identified to know whether the prior permission is required or not. So when I know where data is available, then I have to go and find whether the data is freely available or should I get permission. If it is necessary to get permission to use the data, then it is better to ask for permission before we acquire the data, before we collect the data, and before we analyze the data. The good news now is, nowadays, is many organizations, which includes universities or some laboratories and so on, they are making many data sets available without any condition. So these data sets are known to be data sets in the public domain. So if I can find some data set in the public domain, then I can easily use it. I don't have to acknowledge anybody. But some organizations say that, okay, you can mention in your work that the data has been acquired from this source, and you may acknowledge or thank that source, that the certain organization allowed us to use the data, therefore we thank them because it has saved our efforts and time in acquiring the data. So the only requirement in using data obtained from a secondary source is that the source of data must be acknowledged in the PhD thesis or the research paper. So as they say, uh, give respect or give acknowledge where it is due. So if I have obtained data from some other person, somebody else has spent effort and time to collect the data. So at least acknowledge, at least mention the name. Now, the most common way of collecting primary data is survey sampling. So most of the primary data is collected through sample surveys. Therefore, some familiarity with survey sampling is necessary. Survey sampling involves some important technical terms. So if we understand these technical terms, then even reading material related to survey sampling will be easy. So what are the important technical terms? Look at the bottom two lines: population, sampling unit, sampling frame, sample. These are the entities which are collections. And then three quantities known as parameter, statistic, and estimator. So let us begin. What are the population and sample? These two are collections. So population is in the context of the research. It is not restricted to the dictionary meaning. What is the dictionary meaning of population? It is a collection of people. So many people together form a population. So it is like the city population, state population, country population, and so on. So population in general means collection of people. But in statistics, a population can be a collection of individuals, families, households, many objects, villages, towns, cities, even crop, even water samples, even soil samples. So the concept of a statistical population can relate to any object which is identifiable and uh, separable. So if it is a population of individuals, I should be able to identify each person separately. So I can select whatever is required. If it is say if I want a forest census, tree census in a city, then every tree should be located, identified, maybe numbered, so that I can collect a sample from of the trees. So it can be collection of any objectives. Only what is required, the population must be defined without any ambiguity, and the population must be completely known. If I don't know certain part, don't include it in the definition of the population. So a statistical population is a collection of individual members of a well-defined collection of entities with a variable of interest. So one component of part of the definition of population is the individuals who form the population, and second is what am I observing on this population. So the variable of interest also has to be specified when I talk of a statistical population, because as soon as I get a sample from this population, I only observe the variable of interest. I don't observe other things. Once I have understanding of the our population, an individual member of the population that can provide us a value of the variable is called a sampling unit. So a sampling unit can be an individual person, can be a family, can be a household, can be a village, can be a town. So what I select from the population, one individual, is a sampling unit. Why? Because we select sampling units. If I want to carry out a household survey, then every household will become a sampling unit. If I want to look at per capita income, then the individuals will be my sampling units. So depending on my objective, in the same human population, my sampling units for the survey for my purpose can be different. So a sampling unit must be clearly defined. It must be identifiable. That is, I should be able to identify who is who. Accessible, I should be able to go and access and get information, and also available for making observations. Sampling frame. Now these two ideas, population and sampling unit together, tell us that if I make a list of all sampling units in the population, I call it a sampling frame. Why? Because in the sampling frame, not only all the units in the population are there, but they are also given numbers. A sampling frame is used for selecting individual sampling units to form the population. So a sampling frame is an enumeration, the list of sampling units. So for example, the say in old days we used to say a telephone directory. So if I want to take a survey of people who have telephones, then the telephone directory gives me a sampling frame. In today's day, what we can say, if I look at the election list, the voters list, that can be a sampling frame for the voters in a certain area. So sampling frames are not only having the sampling units in the population, but they are enumerated. So I can select or identify. Because as we have said earlier, a sampling unit must be identifiable. Now, how do we identify it? If we identify it by name, there may not be uniqueness. But if I have assigned them numbers, then in the sampling frame, every sampling unit is identifiable uniquely. So sampling frame is an important thing. So target population. So we have an interest in some population that may be vague in our mind, but we call it the target population. Why? Because we want to select the sample from this target population. In some situations, all the sampling units in the target population may not be accessible, may not be available. Then what we do, we limit our survey to some part of the target population. Then we call this part of the population that we can access and select sampling units from, we call it the study population. So target population may be ideal, study population is real. Why? Because after the analysis, my result should be applicable only to the study population, not to the target population. Finally, we come to the concept of sample. So after we select some sampling units from the population, and for so that we can acquire data, obtain data, observe data on these individuals, this collection is called a sample. So in other words, a sample is a part of the population. How do we observe, collect the sample? There are methods for selection. So that is known as a sampling design. How do we select the sampling units from the population? So once the sample is selected, observations are made on individual sampling units in the sample. What is our interest? Our interest is in some quantity related to the population. For example, I may be interested in the per capita income in India. So my population is all the entire country, India. the nation of India, all the people in India form the population. My sample maybe, I select a sample from this population. What I observe the income of those people in the sample. Ultimately, what is my interest? My interest is in trying to find out the per capita income in India of all Indian citizens. So my parameter of interest is maybe per capita income. Now I can also measure the income of each individual in my sample. So what I'll calculate is the per capita income in the sample. What do I do with it? I assume that my sample being a good representative of the population, whatever I get as the per capita income in the sample, I claim that the per capita income in the population is also same. So when I use the quantity from sample, I call it a statistic. The quantity on the population, which is in my mind, which I can never find. So it is not known, but it is a constant. Why? Because it does not change. It is on the same population. So the population quantity is called a parameter. The sample quantity is called a statistic. And when I use a sample quantity to get information on the population quantity, then I call the sample quantity an estimator. That is, it gives me some information or some idea about the population parameter. For example, the per capita income in my sample is an estimator of the per capita income in the population. Now, if my sample is limited only to Maharashtra, then I will say that, okay, because my target population is India, but my study population is Maharashtra, the per capita income in my sample can only give me estimate of the per capita income in Maharashtra, not for the entire country. And therefore, the construction of estimator also is important. How do I calculate this? So the sample mean, as a simple example, the sample mean is used as an estimator of the population mean, the most popular quantity. So basically, let us recapture the target population is the group of individuals to whom we wish to generalize the findings. Study population is the actual sampling frame from which we have drawn the sample. We make calculations on observations in the sample and claim that same or similar results would be obtained if the same calculations are made on all sampling units in the population. So this is where I try to generalize. What I observe in the sample, I claim to be true also for the population. This taking the result from the sample to the population is called inference, statistical inference. And therefore, what we should remember is statistical inference is inductive from part to the entire whole. Mathematics is deductive. We know the nature rules of mathematics and we apply them in a particular example. So from the universal to the individual is deductive, from part to whole is inductive. So this step of going from sample to the population uses the law of induction, and this activity is known as statistical inference. Now there are some methods of selecting samples. So we call them sampling procedures. The procedure that I use for sampling. There are two major types of sampling procedures. One is called probability sampling, other is called non-probability sampling. In probability sampling, we assign a probability to every sampling unit so that the sampling unit may have higher or better or lower chance of getting selected depending on the probability. Non-probability sampling, there is no probability assignment. So there can be subjectivity in non-probability sampling. For example, convenience sampling. So I go and call some people by convenience and I take a survey. Now this will be non-probability sampling. So there can be a convenient sampling. There can be what we call quota sampling, that I want certain people, so many people from this industry, so many people from another industry. So it can be quota sampling. So there are different sampling methods where probability is not involved. There can be, and there are many sampling methods where the selection is made according to some probability law. So we have two basic categories, probability sampling and non-probability sampling. Probability sampling assigns a probability of selection to every sampling unit in the population. So probability sampling is used in quantitative research because there is a quantification in terms of the probability. A sample selected by probability sampling is representative of the population, and because it is representative, whatever we find in the sample we expect to also have in the population. So probability sampling can be used in different ways by dividing the population according to the variability in the population. So now once we decide to use probability sampling, then we look at the population. Is the population homogeneous or heterogeneous? If it is heterogeneous, then observing uh, sampling units from different parts of the population can change our inference. And therefore, we have to take care of that result not being very sensitive, not being very unstable. So probability sampling allows statistical analysis and inference from the sample to the due to the theory of probability. On the other hand, non-probability sampling is used for qualitative research. For example, we have interviews, we have case studies. Now, how does a researcher decide on whom to call for interview, whom to call for a case study? That is all qualitative. There is no quantification, there is no probability sampling. So a sample selected by non-probability sampling cannot be claimed to be representative of the population. For example, if I want to look at the say deprivation or malnutrition, obviously I cannot take a probability sampling. I have to go and find out the malnutrition cases and select more people, more children who are malnourished, so I get correct information on the malnutrition problem. So there are situations where non-probability sampling is not bad, and there are many situations where probability sampling is necessary, and therefore we should know both of them. When we come to the actual research, we can decide and then use one of them. Now, what are the possible problems? Results obtained from the sample selected by non-probability sampling cannot be generalized. So what I observe in my sample may not exactly happen in the entire population because my sample has been selected with a purpose. So I may have a purposive sample, and therefore I don't want to generalize. What I do, I say only this is happening in the sample. So when do we use this method? When the research is descriptive, when I only want to know what is the situation. So descriptive research can very often use non-probability sampling. The second part is sample size. How many observations should I take? The question of sample size is related to the variability. If the variable of interest like income has lot of variation from very low income to very high income, then I need a larger sample size. But if I look at the height, for example, as a variable, then as compared to income, height has less variability. And therefore, if I want to estimate the average height of an Indian male, then the sample size requirement may not be as much as the sample size requirement if I am observing income. So depending on the variability of the interest, the sample size will change. So what is the relationship between the variability and the sample size? And why? Why does higher variability lead to a larger sample size? So there is one step intermediate. What is that? We have to understand that variability leads to uncertainty. When there is more variation in a phenomenon, then what I observe will be more uncertain. So the more variation we observe in the population, the more uncertain we are about the inference drawn from a sample. So if I find that the incomes are very high variability, then if I observe 10 people, their income can they can be very different from one sample to the other, and therefore there is more uncertainty. And therefore, and uncertainty means low reliability or low precision. So variability provides information. So if there is no variation, there is no information. We don't need observations. So variability at the two ends is bad. Too much of variability leads to too much of uncertainty, and too low or no variability means there is no information. Everything is the same, and therefore we are interested in a reasonable variability. And what we find is most of the quantities of interest have some natural variability. Even think of height, think of income, even in the same one office, people with the same designation, their salaries may not be identical. Why? There is some natural variability, maybe due to seniority, maybe due to the say increment date. So for different reasons, we can say that variability is natural. It is the nature of even the life. If we look at plants, if we look at animals, we may say, okay, certain plant achieves a height of so and so, the leaf size is so and so, but all the leaves are not identical in size. So there is always a variability. Only what is our interest? The larger the variability, larger the sample size. The lower the variability, we can work with a smaller sample size. When the variability is very high, we call such a population heterogeneous. When the variability is low, we call such a population homogeneous, that is having similar values. So three quantities decide the sample size. I will not go into the formula as such. I will only give you an outline. So what are the three factors that we consider for determining the sample size? First is the variability in the population, margin of error, that is how much error are we willing to tolerate, and the level of confidence, that is I want to claim my results with 90% confidence or 95% confidence. So there are three things that we should determine, that is they are in our control. What are they? Variability in the population is natural, we have to know it but may not be able to control. Second is margin of error, that is our choice, that is what is our tolerance. Do I allow 10% error to be okay, or should I restrict it to 5%? So margin of error and level of significance. So how strong a result do I want? Now once these three are given, there are many online sample size formulas, sample size calculators. So we don't have to go into that. There is some mathematical formula. Then we come to probability sampling. So again, if you read a sampling book, when you come to this situation, there are methods like simple random sampling, that is select the sample from the entire population. If the population is heterogeneous, then we divide the population into smaller parts and select sample from the smaller parts, so that the variability within a stratum is a part of the population. So within the part of the population, the variability is low, and therefore a smaller sample will work. Then there is another way of dividing the population into smaller parts which are similar to each other. Then these are called clusters. And then we can sample some clusters, so we call it cluster sampling. Then there are methods like two-stage sampling. That is, we first divide the entire population into smaller parts, select some of them, then again divide these into even smaller subparts and select some of them. So two-stage, multi-stage. So there are methods of collecting or selecting a sample. Non-probability sampling, as I said, convenient sampling, quota sampling, snowball sampling, purposive sampling. So there are some methods by which samples can be obtained. Only what is the limitation? We cannot generalize the results. But in many cases, especially qualitative research, these methods of sampling are okay, because I may be interested in some characteristic which is rare, and being rare, I may not be observed enough. I may not be able to observe enough under simple random sampling. Oh, obviously, what I have to do is use a non-probability sampling method. Then there are certain situations where we have a questionnaire. We don't go and measure, but we send a questionnaire, ask people to fill the questionnaire, get the response, and analyze the questionnaire. So many sample surveys require personal opinion, choice, reaction, feedback, suggestion. So in such cases, a common practice is to prepare a questionnaire and administer it on the selected sample. So there are methods. Again, there are some techniques to deal with questionnaires. For example, the important situation or decision is to decide how long the questionnaire should be, how many questions should be there, what should be the questions, how should the questions be worded so that the respondent is not hurt, is not sensitive to the question. So questions should be straightforward, unambiguous. Then the question is how many questions included. So we should only include important questions in the questionnaire. Then we have to also arrange these questions in a meaningful order and then format them. That is, wording also should be carefully made. So there are so many aspects, even when we want to prepare a questionnaire. So we can see now after we collect the data either through a survey, through a questionnaire, or by measurements, we have to prepare the data. So after preparing a questionnaire, we get the data, then we prepare in the sense that then we decide, do we enter the data? Nowadays what will happen, all the data will have to be entered in a computer. Now when I decide to enter the data in a computer, then I should decide if I have a yes no type of answer, should I type yes and no, or should I type 1 and 0? So there will be a question of coding. When the responses are in words, I can code them numerically so that analysis becomes easy, because a computer can find it easy to count how many times ones have occurred, how many times zeros have occurred, how many times twos have occurred, rather than reading the text, because sometimes the first letter may be capital, the first letter may not be capital. Computer will treat these as two different responses, and so on. So data preparation is also an important step. Then we have to clean the data, that is, verify that there are no suspicious values suddenly occurring in the data. And then after we carry out analysis, I am not talking of analysis at all, because we are looking at the general research methodology. So after we get the analysis, how do we report the results? So this is also an important topic. So first we must prepare a layout of the report. Then we must arrange the reports in logical order for the presentation. Then we must format the results properly. So what is the format? And finally, the report is prepared according to these three steps. And then again, finally, we should make some suggestions, recommendations, so that the other researchers who are interested in a similar research will get some guidelines. Then we can think of preparing research papers, because every research activity must result in at least one research paper, on the basis of which on the research outcome. So writing research papers, it may be for a conference or it may be for a journal, for submission to a research journal. So both of these have certain rules and regulations. Then when we write a research paper, there may be a review process. So we get a feedback from the reviewers. Then we may have to modify, correct, or change the research paper in the light of the feedback. Then we submit the final version after making the necessary changes. And then we can make a presentation version of the paper if I want to present the paper in a conference. Whereas if I want to write a research paper for publication, the process may be a little more tougher, because it is going to take a longer time, because once a publication is printed in a journal, it becomes a permanent document. So the reviewers of a journal are more careful than the reviewers in a conference. And then PhD thesis, most of us will have the ultimate goal of the research to be a PhD thesis. So why is a PhD thesis written? To obtain the degree. So PhD thesis must be obtained, written very carefully. So there are again recommendations about how to prepare a PhD thesis. So I will not go in this. So these are my observations on what are research methodologies. I will also recommend you a book on research methodology by Professor Kothari. I think many of you, or those, at least those who have started thinking about research, may have also found out this book, Research Methodology. And what is happening now in most of the universities, research methodology is now becoming a common thing, because most of the even PG students are now required to write research papers. They may be for publication, maybe for conferences, but now research has become a necessary component of higher education. And therefore, we must always think of research problems, research activities, and they involve research methodology. So I think that I have given some introduction on the research methodology. I hope that you like it. Thank you.